I want to talk about the difference between human objective experience and subjective experience. You see, we live in a world where there's 8 billion different perspectives about reality. Yet, there is really just one observable reality out there. And so we can all agree that there are objects and things. Yet, the way in which we interpret our worlds profoundly defines our individual experiences. And what I want to share is how is it that human beings developed a subjective experience at all? How this came to be is a very profound moment. While psychology tends to look at the human being as a product of the environment, the truth is that the environment that each individual experienced as their childhood was certainly an environment. However, the interpretation of the environment, as remembered, was already created in one moment of every human being's life. The proverbial notion that there's something wrong with me is an experiential paradigm that is unavoidable for all people. This notion of self, that I am somehow damaged or afflicted, for most people will last the entire duration of one's life. This singular experience gives rise to the entire psychological presentation of human beings, where what's described in psychology is merely the expression of the individual's subjective self. How this something's wrong with me came to originate in the human experience was a single moment that gave rise to every other trigger, every other notion of self that you may call a limiting belief. All suffering, all selfishness, all recurring repetitive behaviors, and all compensatory ways of being and acting. Nice, funny, perfect, strong, you name it, originated in a single moment. This represents the original sin. What happened in this experience was the unavoidable collision in our collective evolution. And understanding its origins has profound implications for the entire field of psychology, where understanding and assimilating this knowledge has the power to not only transform psychology as a field of study and practice, but bring into existence the answer to the inhumanity that we must consider when reflecting upon our collective history. It also brings into focus enlightenment. And rather than having enlightenment relegated to mystical and spiritual experiences, still remaining on the periphery of our collective awareness, not yet incorporated into the ordinary field of study we call psychology, is a very important thing to note, that there is a connection. You see, the animal fight or flight reaction, if you were to understand it as part of the autonomic nervous system, we're very familiar with the physiology of it. You know, what it does in terms of preparing the organism for fight or flight. But the psychological implications are the exact and direct cause of the suspension of the human and their conscious, wakeful experience of being alive including the internal dynamics of their self-awareness, their capacity to reflect, and even their view of their past and the lens through which they examine their own memories. The fight or flight reaction creates for any animal an all-encompassing fear state that provides enough emotional motive to fight to the death or run for your life. This is an unavoidable phenomenon for the human being and unavoidable for children. What happens is that when an animal has a fight or flight reaction, the reaction is always associated with an external threat. It causes tunnel vision. The tunnel vision is a psychological dynamic where everything observable to the animal and all potential behavior responses becomes concentrated, where the animal's own momentary awareness becomes condensed to make the entire external experience of the animal an attachment to the threat itself. Every movement that the animal must make has to be in unison with the threat in order to cause the animal to behave in a way that will give it the best chances of survival. That means when the animal is looking at the other animal, its eyes are still picking up the entire environment, and its ears are picking up all the auditory, as well as its sense of smell and every other sensory neuron. However, the experience of the animal is going to be limited to only that which is relevant towards survival. That the brain has to organize all the data and concentrate it to only that which matters for survival. And so it blocks out any auditory information that is not related to survival, or any visual, or even any olfactory or other sensors, even pain, so that the animal does not acknowledge those other variables, and so its decision making will not be inclusive of those. It's why human beings will trample each other in a panic, because they will be blocked from experiencing the observed other people, even though their brain did in fact see it. If you were running out of a movie theater to avoid, say, an attacker, you will see the movie poster, you will see everyone's outfit, you will see the pattern on the carpet, but you will not be aware of it because your mind will find the exit and give you a very limited range of motion in terms of your potential decision making. It eliminates and excludes anything unrelated to survival. The reason this is important in generating a subjective experience is that original fight or flight reaction, the state change, has one unique feature for the human being: the notion of me. When a child is exposed to a loud sound, it could be the parents fighting, for example, this will trigger their first fight or flight reaction. The child will suddenly experience a surge of adrenaline. The fear of life and death will appear. This will cause the experience of abandonment. The child will now perceive the parents as a physical threat, just like a bear. The size differential will cause paralysis and fear. It'll transform the parents from caregivers into predators. The child will interpret that something's wrong not as them, but as me, based on the profound state change being a new phenomenon. Imagine drinking a cup of coffee loaded with adrenaline, or eating a brownie and not knowing it was a weed brownie. Well, the state change causes the experience of there being something wrong with me. Cascading thoughts: not good enough, small, helpless, broken, abandoned. Experiential emotions, sadness, fear, will now become enmeshed into the fight or flight reaction, each individual thought becoming a perceived trigger, and the child will never leave the fight or flight psychology, only reaching homeostasis with respect to the physiology of anxiety. This results in the subjective experience, aka the ego, an inescapable paradigm psychology today merely describes. Now, when the child experiences the fear of the fight or flight for the first time, this radical state change with the adrenaline, the butterflies, the pounding heart, the fear that is so severe, it's the motive for fighting to the death or running for your life. This radical state change always includes the notion that there's something wrong here. Animals always attribute this to external threats, but what makes the human being unique is that by this age, the child has already developed a notion of self, me, language. Language is what separates humans from animals, including a visual imagination, a virtual reality that human beings would use to think about the future and engage in thoughts that would enable them to have strategic, creative advantages, be able to predict outcomes even before they happen, or go out and mitigate and have this profound intellectual capacity that would reduce our dependence on our physical strength. But this fight or flight reaction, when activated, an unavoidable collision between our animal past and our sentient future, has created an evolutionary fork in the road for all of us. What happens is that this state change, creating this fear, is interpreted by the child in an inescapable thought: something is wrong with me. This emergency state, this fear that they experience for the first time, the body changes, the butterflies, the pounding heart, the dilated pupils. This is a profound moment that defines all moments. It enters a child into a perpetual state of fear. Fear that becomes imperceptible later as the physiology of the sympathetic nervous system fizzles out through homeostasis. But it creates an experiential jungle. The something's wrong with me begins a process of pattern recognition, where the something's wrong with me is not an authentic notion, because the physiology of the fight or flight is not a malfunction, but it represents a collision, because the human brain did not evolve to accommodate language. It developed so much intelligence that we were able to then start to use words to communicate. And when we created the thought of me, we created a profound problem. That the something's wrong transfers into something's wrong with me. And as the child looks at the arbitrary environment, they patternize everything as to be a result of the something's wrong with me. The fear of their parents, because they're in this heightened state of fear, where animals would view another animal as a threat to their own existence, is now getting embedded with thoughts where they feel like they're small. They can't do anything to stop dad or mom. They're helpless. They're stuck. The confusion. The experience of unlovability. As they interpret the threat of their parents, they lose the caregiver interpretation and never regain it fully. The thought that they're not enough to help mom or to stop dad, or whatever it was that they believed they did wrong to cause this profound emotional consequence, is now being explained with rapid thoughts. And every emotion experienced, sadness, anger, frustration, helplessness, powerlessness, thoughts of brokenness, all become part of the fight or flight pattern mechanism. And so the child, misinterpreting the environment, will always now have a profound fear of being not good enough for their parents. They will create a notion that they need to figure out how to be perfect to avoid recreating this all-encompassing life or death fear state. They think they need to be perfect and infinitely adaptive. I'll do anything it takes to prevent this feeling. leads to other ways of being, like strong to compensate for weakness, funny to compensate for not belonging, being analytical to compensate for experiential stupidity. Every single thought, many of which are universal and many of which are situationally unique, become pattern recognition devices that cause perpetual avoidance. The child generates an overarching, illusory external experience that will keep them locked in fight or flight. Avoiding failure is flight. Trying to achieve success is fight. The decision-making apparatus of every human being becomes concentrated within the fixation on all the potential challenges of life. That a future test will create anxiety because if you don't do well enough, you will activate disappointment, aka I wasn't good enough, and the recreation of this fear state will then happen as a trigger. This is why you form trauma bonds, because when you experience being not enough because of someone else's displeasure, that's pattern recognition. Their disappointment, the tone of their voice, the temperament, triggers you to experience yourself as resulting in those other people's sadness. You then become fixated on making them happy to escape the feeling of not enough. That is why we are the sheep amongst the wolves. That is why our behaviors always result in profound confusion and disappointment, is why when you know what's going on and then you go to deal with someone and they trigger you with a guilt trip, they can transform your own reality because the guilt presupposes fault and your mind fixates on escaping the guilt, just like trying to run out of a movie theater. You will live your life in an invisible jungle where every single thought and trigger that you originated at 5 years old becomes an experiential, invisible, illusory overlay that defines every waking moment. It destroys access to your imagination because when you think about tomorrow, you inspire doubts, fears, not enough. You don't want to take risks because the payoff of success is never going to be experienced in the same way as the fear of failure. This results in varying, profound levels of varying access to creativity, to our own inherent genius, and results in a subjective, illusory state where we manage the genesis of this illusion through confusion. Confusion is caused by a subconscious awareness of an impending trigger that is avoided through confusion to dissociate oneself from the observation of something that would cause the feelings of being abandoned. And so your mind will prioritize lesser emotional triggers like guilt rather than recognizing that this human being is not a good person. And this causes the genesis of a subjective future to create hope, to counterbalance the subjective potential failures or the ongoing understanding of the futility of your life, because you continue to operate within this dynamic and the subjective experience eliminates objectivity and causes repetitive, involuntary mistakes as the decision-making apparatus is always entirely fixated merely on the aversion of emotional distress in the pursuit of the happiness displaced by the trigger itself. Creates a someday future of your happiness contingent upon mitigating every trigger in your world, an internal preoccupation with life's problems, segregating you from the objective experience all other animals enjoy. Now, meditation caused enlightenment. And how did it do that? Well, meditating is the deepest state of relaxation. What it did is it turned off the sympathetic nervous system. When the sympathetic nervous system was turned off, the fight or flight reaction that caused the tunnel vision and the pervasive subjective experience within this reactionary illusory reality dissolved. And the individual in this state of meditation had a restoration towards the entireness of their conscious experience, one that allowed self-reflection outside the boundaries of fear. A re-examination of their entire reality emerged. The earliest practitioners, like the Buddha, documented this experience and explained it and created entire philosophies in an effort to convey the good news to humanity, that suffering was something that we could all escape. And the suffering that we would be escaping is the fear, is the reactivity, is the personalization of the behaviors of others as to ascertain our own identities, the all-encompassing reactionary subjective experience was discovered to be illusory. Now, the unfortunate reality is that this extraordinary experience that was thought to be spiritual was also experienced by other people, like Jesus. And both within the Old and New Testaments, you find that they are discussing the genesis of the objective and subjective experience. That let there be light was certainly the genesis of the universe and creation, but it was from the perspective of a child opening their eyes for the first time and seeing light. No discernment exists in the mind of the baby, and over a period of time, reality starts to form. When you talk about the tree of life, they're talking about the domain of the imagination that's experiential and visual. And when you talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're talking about the mind of analyzing and ruminating. The original sin was Adam and Eve biting from the tree of knowledge, and the serpent, aka Satan, is the voice in the head that is a result of the genesis of the subjective experience, a voice that, through rumination and confusion, redefines reality as a way to avoid the consequences of observable reality that would be experienced as a profound trigger, and causes the maintenance and emergence of the subjective experience. People attached to their perspectives through dogma and belief, righteous entitlement to have their perspective prevail, are simply preserving the illusory future that they are attached to through the fear of death itself. It is why we attack our visionaries. It is why we deny reality that we find unfavorable. It is why an athlete will only argue on behalf of their own team, and is why humans lost all objectivity. It's why we have group thinking, to reaffirm and reassure our collective perspective, a perspective that is catered to our desires, our wants. Because our desires and our wants reflect our individual effort to escape our own suffering, suffering we have not collectively identified as anomalous and unnatural. Ontology, using modern psychology, took more careful looks at these experiences attained through meditation and generated profound exercises that would directly address these dynamic reactions to eliminate them, where transformation of self could be attained in a seminar like Earhart's seminar trainings that later became Landmark Education and Landmark Worldwide, where without even looking at psychology, people would have experiential transformations that were unattainable in psychological practice. Because these experiences are not something relatable to people who have never themselves experienced it, the unfortunate reality is that the entire field of psychology is merely looking through the kaleidoscope of the subjective human experience in an effort to try to fix that something's wrong. The entire motive to cracking the code of the human mind is the practitioner's own experiential trauma. The motive for all psychologists that have ever attempted to describe the human mind are people themselves who have never escaped the subjective experience. And so, unfortunately, psychology addresses the subjective experience as a permanent feature, failing to incorporate the teachings of those who have obliterated the entire psychological dynamics that imperiled their own experience. It is very similar to a theologian that can get a PhD in emphasis in Zen Buddhism and understand all the terminology, but merely have a philosophical understanding of what was described as enlightenment. That enlightenment is not something you can understand within the analytical and ruminating mind, because you can never even come close to approximating the experience merely by trying to understand it. That is why religions have become dogmatic, because rather than taking the teachings that cause enlightenment from, say, the Jesus or Buddha, we've had to interpret them in a way understandable to the masses of people, yet to escape the subjective experience, so they will not know what was described as God, they will not know what was described as being born again, and they will not see the continuity of these experiences where the kingdom of God or heaven was the experiential equivalent of nirvana or enlightenment for the Buddha, and hell was the experiential equivalent of ordinary human suffering. And sin was merely a model of thinking and behaving for the preservation of the objective experience that would cause the avoidance of things that would recreate the experiential triggers, causing someone to find their way back to hell. And God was this profound connection to this expansive conscious experience, where there was something magic about that, where in this realm, this expanse, one starts to see the spontaneity of ideation coming from nothing, where one has the experience of all potential ways of being, where one has conscious freedom outside the boundaries of behaving in an animalistic and reactionary fashion, and one would have compassion for those who have yet to discover God. Forgive them, for they know not what they do, was the forgiveness of all people on the basis that they cannot themselves escape their own rudimentary, fear-based, reactionary, external and internal world. And that is the connection between enlightenment and ordinary psychology. Single moment origins, where we all fell from grace. I think, therefore I am.